Welcome to part 5 of our series on the Family Proclamation. Here we're going to discuss another core element of the Family Proclamation, and that is its warnings. We read in the Family Proclamation, "We warn that individuals who violate covenants of chastity, who abuse spouse or offspring, or who fail to fulfill family responsibilities, will one day stand accountable before God. Further, we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society." Now, to understand why the prophets speak so firmly in a warning voice about calamities that come from abandoning the ideals of the Family Proclamation, we have to have a basic grasp of the spiritual forces at work in the world. Our understanding is that in premortality we lived in God's celestial order, and then Satan introduced chaos or entropy because it seemed more fair and equitable than God's order. What I mean by this is Satan hated any kind of hierarchies. And he hated differences in outcomes. He hated roles, all of those things that were part of God's order for his children. Having some exposure to the opposing forces of God's order and chaos and entropy, we embraced spiritual development by actively choosing God's order. We embraced a plan that would allow us to continue this process through mortal embodiment and continued exposure to opposing forces. Motivated by grievances and envy, Satan chose to become an active agent of chaos in the world, co-opting cultural, political, and religious systems to create chaos and destroy God's order. The people called and tasked with modeling God's order to the nations are called Israel, those who wrestle with God and allow God to prevail. We read of God's vision for Israel in the Old Testament in passages like this, where God promises Abraham that in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And we see this vision again in the dedicatory prayer of Solomon's temple, where Solomon prays that, "Moreover, concerning a stranger that is not of thy people Israel, but cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake, for they shall hear of thy great name, and of thy strong hand, and of thy stretched out arm. When he shall come and pray toward this house, the temple, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee for, that all people of the earth may know thy name, to fear thee, as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have builded is called by thy name." This is God's intention for Israel to model God's ways to the rest of humanity. And Israel's sacred history teaches us foundational mechanisms that enable us to understand God's order, revelation, the family, prophets, covenants, and Zion community. Let's look at the family in Israel's sacred history. We learn in Genesis that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. We're also told, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." We see powerful principles in family dynamics in the story of Jacob and Esau. "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them, and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept." It's a powerful story of estrangement and reconciliation, and how those principles were learned and applied in a family context. We also learn powerful principles about adoption in the book of Ruth. "And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people, and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return for following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." We also learn of the hard consequences for a nation when family breakdown occurs, even in its leading families. In the story of David, we read, "And the king said unto Cushi, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushi answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." And finally, in the story of Jesus, we learn important lessons about family dynamics. A great example is when we learn of his parents' response after finding him teaching in the temple. "And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. And he went down with them, and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." That last sentence is very important. Jesus' family context provided the very best possible conditions for him to flourish as a human being. When the prophets warn about the disintegration of families, they're pointing to a reality that when children are raised in environments that do not reflect the ideal, they face an uphill battle compared to other children who are raised in the ideal. This reality is validated in a lot of social science research. So this is an important warning for the world, but let's also talk about warnings for the church. And here let's listen to something that was spoken by Elder M. Russell Ballard years ago.
Let us beware of false prophets, brothers and sisters, both men and women, who are self-appointed declarers of the doctrines of the church and who seek to spread their false gospel and attract followers by sponsoring symposia, books, and journals. Beware of those who speak and publish in opposition to God's true prophets and who actively proselyte others with reckless disregard for the eternal well-being of those whom they seduce. Like Nehor and Korihor in the Book of Mormon, they rely on the sophistry to deceive and entice others to their views. They set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world, but they seek not the welfare of Zion. Of such, President Joseph S. Smith warned when he spoke of the proud and self-vaunting ones, who read by the lamps of their own conceit, who interpret by rules of their own contriving, who have become a law unto themselves and so pose as the sole judges of their own doings. They also attempt to redefine the nature of the Godhead, and they deny that God has given and continues to give revelation today to his ordained and sustained prophets. False prophets and false teachers are those who arrogantly attempt to fashion new interpretations of the Scripture, to demonstrate that these sacred texts should not be read with God's words to his children, but merely as the utterances of uninspired men, limited by their own prejudice and cultural biases. They argue, therefore, that the Scriptures require new interpretation and that they are uniquely qualified to offer that interpretation. Perhaps most damningly, they deny Christ's resurrection and atonement, arguing that no God can save us. They reject the need for a Savior. In short, these detractors attempt to reinterpret the doctrines of the church to fit their own preconceived views, and in the process deny Christ and his messianic role. False prophets and false teachers are those who attempt to change the God-given and scripturally based doctrines that protect the sanctity of marriage, the divine nature of the family, and the essential doctrine of personal morality. They advocate a redefinition of morality to justify fornication, adultery, and homosexual relationships. Some openly champion the legalization of so-called same-gender marriages. To justify their rejection of God's immutable laws that protect the family, these false prophets and false teachers even attack the inspired proclamation on the family issued to the world in 1995 by the First Presidency and the 12 Apostles.
It's clear that Elder Ballard was warning us very clearly that forces of chaos were at work in the church, even back then, and this is even more true now. But why would Elder Ballard talk about opposition to the family proclamation and use the term false prophets? The reason is because the ideology that rejects the family proclamation is, in fact, a rival religious system. It has a rival God. Look at this article stating the obvious. Self-worship is the world's fastest growing religion. Here's a New York Times piece about the empty religions of Instagram. It says, left-wing secular millennials may follow politics devoutly, but the women we've chosen as our moral leaders aren't challenging us to ask the fundamental questions that leaders of faith have been wrestling with for thousands of years. Why are we here? Why do we suffer? What should we believe in beyond the limits of our puny selfhood? The whole economy of Instagram is based on our thinking about ourselves, posting about ourselves, and working on ourselves. Now here's a quote that's a little more shocking, and this is from a leading voice in Satanism. She says, the idea of worshiping Satan is ridiculous. We worship ourselves, first and foremost. And we use the satanic as a metaphor for calling forth the powers within ourselves that we find enriching or enlivening. Satan has always been a metaphor of defiance, fortitude against all odds, and self-determination in whatever guises he is represented. It might be shocking for some to know that Satanism really is a religion of self-worship. And a lot of people have adopted that religion without calling it what it really is. One of the most popular influencers on social media, Glennon Doyle, offers messages like this. She says, my only expectation is that you become yourself. The more deeply I know you, the more beautiful you become to me. If someone tells you who they are, consider how lucky you are to be graced with that gift. Don't respond with an eviction notice, a permission slip, or a concession speech. Ungod yourself. Gasp in awe and applaud with gusto. Self-worship is the core of modern secular religion, which regards self as the only God worth worshiping. The religion that opposes the family proclamation also has a rival theology. Here we have a screenshot of the YouTube channel Queer Theology. I'm not going to weave in any of their videos here, but suffice it to say, this is a powerful rival theology that has overtaken a lot of people's thinking in questions of gender and sexuality. The religion that opposes the family proclamation has rival views of sin and redemption. Here's an article that says, Dear straight people, calling homosexuality a sin is still homophobic. The author writes, since the official music video dropped on March 26th, the internet has been abuzz with discussion about Lil Nas X's new song Montero, featuring a heaven and hell theme, with Lil Nas X portraying, among other characters, an Adam-like figure who pole dances down to the underworld before giving Satan a lap dance and taking his place as the ruler of hell. The divinely inspired imagery has provoked ire from conservative commentators. The writer here conveys in this article that the real sin is when we say there is anything wrong with people giving expression to whatever desires they have. The religion that opposes the family proclamation also has rival prophets and teachers. The intellectual pedigree of this religion features people like Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Gail Rubin. And it's not coincidental that many of these figures were advocates for laws that would allow for pedophilia. They wanted to see the removal of any norms whatsoever around gender and sexuality. Even within the church, we have teachers who are teaching the ideas of these people around gender and sexuality. and holding themselves up as more reliable guides to the mind of God than are the leadership of the church. This is why Elder Ballard said years ago that we need to beware of false prophets and teachers in the church. The religion that opposes the family proclamation has rival sacred texts. There are a lot of books that have been put forward that carry more authority than our sacred texts, like the scriptures and conference talks and the teachings of our prophets. The religion that opposes the family proclamation has rival sacred rituals. We've seen in recent years an explosion of attention on drag shows, and these activities are considered sacred. And what do I mean by that? When I say that some part of my belief system is sacred, like when a friend of mine who's not of my faith tells me that I should ditch church, if I tell this person that the sacrament is something that I do everything in my power to experience every week, I can't really describe to my friend why that is. And my friend might become frustrated, especially if this friend wants to do something with me during the time that I'm in sacrament meeting, and I'm having to say no to him as a result. I can't really explain the spiritual value of something that is not spiritually valuable to another person. That is what it means for something to be sacred to me. And when people object to drag performances in the context of churches or in front of children, the response is very similar. We are told that our objections are based in ignorance of some dimension of reality that we are unable to perceive. The religion that opposes the family proclamation also has rival sacraments. Coming out has become a prominent sacrament, regarded as a religious experience for many people. And this religion has rival conversion stories. Look at this article. Jojo Siwa shares her gay awakening story, which all started with Demi Lovato. These stories of awakening are celebrated and revered like religious conversion stories. So it's very clear that when we see these forces at work in the church, people who are promoting this rival religious system in the church rarely accept correction for their behavior, because for them, these are religious commitments, and they are held to with religious devotion. This is why Elder Ballard's warning toward the church was so prophetic when he gave it years ago. And now let's talk about the warning of calamities. When the proclamation speaks of calamities, we can ask this question: how many problems would be solved if the world understood that all people are the family of God, and that this is every soul's true identity, that families in other nations are worth preserving and strengthening? Strong families depend on the decisions of adults to subordinate their own desires and fulfill family roles to ensure the well-being of the next generation, and that every person, whether part of a nuclear family or not, benefits from strong families throughout society. Think of all the wars and turmoil and social upheaval and systemic unfairness that would be remedied if every person were to embrace these truths. And when we don't embrace these truths, when we embrace rival ideologies centered on false self-identity, that is destructive to our spirits. And we can see sharp rises in mental health problems among people who have embraced notions of gender and sexuality that contradict the family proclamation. And now let's turn to the scriptures for some warnings that apply on a personal level. What is the common theme in these scriptural passages? And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. Or when Jesus said, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Or when he said, consider what you hear. With the measurement that you use, it will be measured to you, and more will be added to you. Whoever has, more will be given to him, and whoever does not have, it will be taken from him, even what he has. And finally, from the Book of Mormon, and therefore he that will harden his heart, the same receiveth the lesser portion of the word. And he that will not harden his heart, to him is given the greater portion of the word, until it is given unto him to know the mysteries of God, until he know them in full. And they that will harden their hearts, to them is given the lesser portion of the word, until they know nothing concerning his mysteries. And then they are taken captive by the devil, and led by his will down to destruction. Now this is what is meant by the chains of hell. Why do I put these forward as a personal warning? Well, from personal observation, I can say it is indeed true that Satan is applying forces of chaos to members of the church, especially around questions of gender and sexuality. He is sifting members of the church like wheat. And people who are refusing the gathering influence of the Lord's servants are being scattered. And on an individual spiritual level, I can say from observation, from my own experience and that of others, that when we harden our hearts against the united voice of the Lord's servants, we have a lot of gospel understanding removed from us, and we are given less and less light and understanding until, as the scriptures say, we know nothing concerning his mysteries. I have seen lifelong members of the church, very intelligent, well-read people, whose responses to these doctrines of the family have left them on a downward spiral to where they end up asking even very basic questions about the gospel because they have lost their former understanding. They have lost their former convictions. Chaos and disorder are the normal forces at work in the world, and this reality applies to spiritual things. If we are not actively pursuing the best possible understanding of gospel principles that are being taught consistently in a united voice by the leadership of the church, then our minds and spirits will drift into chaos to the point where we can be trusted with little or no actual God-given understanding of the gospel. That may sound like a stark warning, but the things that the prophets say in the scriptures about the loss of spiritual light and understanding are 100% true. You might have experienced those things personally. I have in my own life. And it pains me to witness these processes at work in the hearts of members of the church, especially in response to the family proclamation. This concludes part 5 in this series. And in the final installment, part 6, I'm going to speak to some hard questions around practical lived realities as we engage with the principles in the family proclamation. Thank you for joining me.